This is the Behind the Line podcast, coming to you from the wacky left coast capital of Seattle. News from the Pacific Northwest, the left coast, the U.S., and the world that matters. The stories the MSM won't talk about. Deciphering the truth through all the lies. For more, visit BehindTheLinePodcast.com.
And back to the left coast for this last story, my home state of liberal Washington. The Washington State House approved a bill that would authorize state agencies to hide children seeking transgender medical intervention from parents. On April 12th, House lawmakers debated Senate Bill 5599, which creates an exemption for the state that grants it the right to not be required to notify parents of minors who have left their homes because their parents wouldn't let them pursue gender transition medical procedures. In a video statement after the vote, Republican State Rep. Chris Corey said the bill erodes parental rights in the state of Washington. Essentially, what the bill would do would be if a child left the parent's home for certain medical care and went to a shelter or host family, that shelter or host family would not be required to notify the parents of their child's whereabouts, Corey said. This is obviously a fundamental violation of parental rights and something that's deeply concerning for parents across Washington state. State Rep. Peter Abarno, a Republican, said the crux of the debate over the bill was whether the state be permitted to essentially hide where the child is. Most parents, Corey said, would go to the ends of the earth to find their child if they disappeared after an argument, and the fact that we have a bill that may become law that would say we're not going to tell you was really just a bridge too far for us, Corey said. Corey told the Epoch Times that under the bill, a disagreement between a child and parents over the child's desire for a medical transition constitutes abuse and neglect, only because the parent hasn't properly affirmed what the child wants. Corey said there are already laws that protect children from abuse and neglect in the state that require solid and compelling reasons why children would need to be removed from their homes. What's frustrating is even in those cases, the parents still have a right to know where their kids are after they've been removed, Corey said. In this case, parents would have no idea. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment gives parents the right to parent through the educating and rearing as they see fit. State Representative Julio Cortez, a Democrat, said, though having a supportive family environment is critical, it doesn't always determine the best outcome for the success of a child's well-being. Really? So, it's better if the state government raises your children or tells you how to raise your children. The House voted 57-39 in favor of the bill after its March passage, and the Senate with a vote of 27-19. The bill will be sent back to the Senate for concurrence on amendments added, among those being a bipartisan agreement to include behavioral counseling services to children while in the state's care. More communism and socialism here on the West Coast. The government taking your kids because your kids are in some kind of fight with you and hiding them from you, not telling you where they're at. This is extremely disturbing. The government has no right to interfere in your family affairs. And if a child is being abused, then yes, there are laws in place to deal with that. But telling a 13-year-old they can't get gender transition surgery is not abuse. It's not abuse. And the government has no right to come take your kids away or tell you otherwise. There is just this constant overstepping of bounds with Democrats, trying to go after every right you have and make you completely subservient to the government. When will all of this be enough? When will people have had enough of this garbage? Here's another big step towards socialism, not that we're not already there. 3 of California's largest electricity providers are proposing a new billing system that would charge customers according to their income. PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric submitted a joint application to the California Public Utilities Commission April 10th. This proposal aims to help lower bills for those who need it most and improves billing transparency and predictability for all customers. The program, if approved, would divide customer utility bills into a fixed infrastructure charge based on income plus a usage charge based on consumption. Wow, they're going to get you both ways, huh? The per kilowatt hour electricity rate would be lowered by about 1/3 for all customers, according to the companies. Low income and disadvantaged customers, about 30% of customers, would be helped the most with the new program, according to PG&E. The proposal calls for the monthly fixed charge for low income customers to be as low as $15 and no greater than $30. On average, PG&E estimates the company's lowest income customers would get a 21% lower electricity bill. Moderate income households would pay a fixed charge of $51 and get about 6% lower bills. High income customers, the state's top 25% of income earners, would pay about $92, seeing an increase of about 24%, according to PG&E. The state's aggressive climate action plans include switching over to renewable energy sources and drastically cutting fossil fuels by 2045. One major component of the state's climate goals is to accelerate electric vehicle use by banning the sale of gas-powered cars by 2035. Again, no plan in place to make that happen, and they already have electricity shortages in California. So how's that going to happen? Who the hell knows? The utilities were required by the state to create a new billing plan after the state's legislature passed Assembly Bill 205 in June of 22. The law requires utilities to structure their billing programs using income levels and provide state funding to help utility customers with past due bills from the pandemic, according to a Senate analysis. The measure also mandates state agencies to prioritize clean energy sources over fossil fuel sources and accelerates clean energy products. Again, so it's not the electric companies coming up with this. It was the state government telling the electric companies to come up with this. And this is punishing people who work hard and make more money by making you pay more for your basic services, also while paying for the basic services of people who don't work or don't work as hard or haven't got education or haven't made life choices that allow them to have a better job. Somehow that's your problem, my problem. These governments are doing everything they can to even the field, to make everybody on the same level. So even if you work hard, you're going to have your money taken away in other places so that you are stuck in the same spot in life as people who haven't worked as hard as you have. This is what they do in places like Russia and China. I would imagine you're going to see this start happening in other liberal, progressive states. It's disturbing. The Communist Republic of California, I think, would be a better name for that state. A Connecticut man who pinned a police officer against a door in the Lower West Terrace Tunnel for more than 2 minutes was sentenced to 7.5 years in federal prison for his role in violence at the U.S. Capitol on January 6. The sentence was less than half the prison time sought by federal prosecutors who asked U.S. District Judge Trevor McFadden to give McConaughey 15 years and 8 months behind bars. McConaughey was convicted of 7 felony charges, 3 counts of aiding or abetting or assaulting, resisting or impeding law enforcement officers, including 1 involving a dangerous weapon, 1 count of obstruction of an official proceeding, 1 count of interfering with a law enforcement officer during a civil disorder, 1 count of disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds with deadly or dangerous weapon, 1 count of engaging in physical violence in a restricted building or grounds with a deadly or dangerous weapon. He was also convicted of 2 misdemeanor charges for disorderly conduct in a Capitol building and committing an act of violence in the Capitol grounds. You know, I was a police officer for 8 years. Field training officer, tactical tracking operations team, trained in interviewing and interrogating and multiple different kinds of investigations, and this is a joke. Do you know how many officers were assaulted during the George Floyd protests throughout the country? Here in the Pacific Northwest, Chicago, all across the country. What kind of sentences do you suppose those people got who assaulted those police officers? Nothing. Days, maybe. But for the most part, nothing. This is pure insanity. This is a total clown show, circus court. Absolutely ridiculous. Totally political. Nothing here is based on precedents for cases like this across the country. Nothing. No part of it whatsoever. Myself, as a police officer, had a on-duty shooting with a guy who tried to run over me with his car, who survived the shooting, but do you know how much time he served? 6 months. 6 months. Tried to kill me. 6 months. This guy pins a cop in a door jam and gets 7.5 years. This whole January 6th thing is a freaking joke. I'm so tired of hearing these Democrats say their lives were in danger, lying about where they were on the Capitol grounds, comparing it to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Are you kidding me? When video comes out showing Capitol Police escorting people through the building, you have very few situations like this, which is minor. I'm sorry, it's minor. When you look at all the things that happen across the country on a daily basis, but during all those riots that were allowed by Democrats and liberals and the government, all the assaults on police officers that happened, trying to burn police buildings down in Seattle and Portland, and these people serve no time, no punishment, no accountability whatsoever. It's all okay. We don't talk about it. We just ignore that ever happened. But then they make this big circus sideshow act of these people that went to the Capitol and did what they did. It's all political. What a joke. The United Nations. Like that creepy uncle nobody wants around at family events. The United Nations is seeking vast new powers and stronger global governance tools to deal with international emergencies such as pandemics and economic crises, a new UN policy brief has revealed, and the Biden administration appears to support the proposal. Well, that's surprising, isn't it? This is an article from the Epoch Times. The plan to create an emergency platform, which would involve a set of protocols activated during crises that could affect billions of people, has already drawn strong concern and criticism from U.S. policymakers and analysts. Among those expressing concern is House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Representative Michael McCaul, Texas, whose committee oversees U.S. foreign policy and involvement in international organizations. We must be sure that any global protocol or platform operated by the UN respects U.S. national sovereignty and U.S. taxpayer dollars, McCall told the Epoch Times. He also noted his concern that the proposed platform expands the authority and funding of the UN and the definitions of emergency and crisis to include, for instance, climate change. UN documents and statements released in March by key leaders of the global organization make clear that climate change is a major piece of the UN emergencies agenda. Other critics who spoke with Epoch Times expressed concern about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, within the UN. the global organization's well-documented corruption problems, and its track record of dealing with previous emergencies. Allowing the UN to deal with this is the equivalent of putting the CCP in charge of global emergencies, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations Kevin Moley told the Epoch Times. In a policy brief dubbed Our Common Agenda, headlined Strengthening the International Response to Complex Shocks and Emergency Platform, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres laid out his vision for empowering the global organization to deal with global crises. The challenges we face can only be addressed through stronger international cooperation, Guterres declared, calling for strengthening global governance for current and future generations. The policy brief builds on an earlier common agenda document and comes as UN leaders outline the plans for a Summit of the Future set to be held during the General Assembly's annual high-level meeting in September. If it gets the green light from member states, the global emergency protocols would be triggered automatically in case of global crisis, regardless of the type or nature of the crisis involved, the UN chief said. The protocols would bring all sorts of institutions together, including national governments, international institutions, and the private sector. Ultimately, all would have to recognize the primary role of the intergovernmental organs, such as the UN agencies, in decision-making, the document states. The emergency platform, once convened, would be a tool for the United Nations system to implement decisions taken by relevant organs, according to the policy brief. A spokesman for the U.S. State Department suggested that the Biden administration backs the plan. The UN proposal was unveiled as multi-billionaire Bill Gates, one of the most prominent voices during the COVID-19 crisis and a major financier of the World Health Organization and vaccines, called for a global fire department to address international health emergencies. The Global Health Emergency Corp will represent massive progress towards a pandemic-free future, Gates wrote in the op-ed. The question is whether we have the foresight to invest in the future now before it's too late. What these people don't seem to learn is you can't control Mother Nature. Even if your little virus was grown in a lab, once it's turned loose into nature, and nature has a hold of it, you're not going to control it. No, this emergency corps would be used to control people, and that's it. Exactly what would constitute an emergency that would trigger the UN emergency response wasn't made clear. The government and these organizations love to be vague, don't they? However, the document states that crises without global consequences would not necessarily be categorized as an emergency requiring UN intervention. In other words, some crises that don't have global consequences might trigger a UN response. The report gives two examples of recent global crises that struck in the 21st century and that the UN leaders believe support the case for coordinated global response: COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis in 2022. Please. The cost of living crisis would be a pandemic of politicians. So how do we eradicate all these politicians? Is there a vaccine for that? Rather than offering specifics, the policy brief offers broad categories and types of emergencies that might activate the global protocols. These include climate or environmental events, environmental degradation, pandemics, accidental or deliberate release of biological agents, disruptions in the flow of goods, people, or finance, disruptions in cyberspace or global digital connectivity, and my personal favorite, a major event in outer space, and unforeseen risks. Well, we've seen all these things in their little list except a major event in outer space, which personally I think is the next thing they're going to lie to us about. Among the reasons for the urgency, the UN stated that international emergencies could undermine progress towards achieving the controversial Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, referred to by UN leaders as the Master Plan for Humanity. Oh my God. The 17 goals, which cover practically every area of life and have come under fire from critics, were signed by virtually all national governments in 2015, with strong support from the Obama administration and the CCP. Two peas in a pod, huh? Although the U.S. Senate hasn't ratified the global agreement as required for all treaties, it's nonetheless being implemented worldwide, as policies in business and government are aligned with the agenda. The policies of Agenda 2030, policies that parallel much of the Great Reset announced in 2020 by Guterres and others, such as Klaus Schwab, at the World Economic Forum, include a renewed social contract. The WEF is a strategic partner of the UN in implementing Agenda 2030, especially in terms of getting the private sector on board globally. One major concern surrounding the crisis response proposal among U.S. leaders is the strong influence of the CCP within the UN, influence that was felt clearly during the pandemic and that CCP critics say could even be more dangerous in future global emergencies. The powerful influence of the CCP and its mostly authoritarian and crony democracy allies over the UN system represents a major danger when it comes to proposals to grant the global outfit more power. The CCP's well-documented control over key UN agencies and even its powerful influence over most member states, approving the emergencies protocol plan would be tantamount to putting the communist regime in charge of global crises. Another critic, international lawyer, and former UN internal investigator turned whistleblower Peter Gallo noted the organization's long history of corruption, politicization, and scandal, including cases in which humanitarian aid was diverted or even weaponized for political purposes. More alarming, though, is what Gallo described as the sexual exploitation and human trafficking of victims of such disasters. UN personnel have an egregious record of involvement in that exploitation themselves, and the organization has a shameful record of covering up allegations of sexual misconduct rather than properly investigating them. Gallo and other former UN officials using UN data estimate that more than 60,000 women and children were raped and sexually abused by UN personnel during the decade-long tenure of Ban Ki-moon, the previous Secretary General. Gallo said he believes that it is a very conservative estimate. There is no evidence of anything being any better under Antonio Guterres, Gallo added, citing impunity for perpetrators and attacks on the UN whistleblowers who have tried to stop it. This is the establishment of a global government, and that is it. It is about controlling you, controlling the country you live in, and bringing us all under one umbrella of government. The Environmental Protection Agency's proposed emission standards for automobiles and trucks are raising eyebrows in the auto industry. EPA's proposed emissions plan is aggressive by any measure. By that, I mean it sets automotive electrification goals in the next few years that are very high. John Bozzella, president and CEO of the automaker trade organization Alliance for Automotive Innovation, wrote in the April 12th blog post, "The federal standards would tightly restrict emissions from new vehicles that would effectively force automakers to boost their sales of electric vehicles. The agency's proposal anticipates that under the new standards, 2/3 of new light-duty vehicles sold in the U.S. would be electric by the model year 2032. It also predicts that 46% of new medium-duty vehicles sold in the United States would be electric by that year as well. EVs made up less than 6% of total new vehicle sales in 2022. That's an increased percentage relative to past years, even as total new vehicle sales were down 13.8 million units from 17.3 million in 2018. The EPA claims that its standards would lower carbon dioxide emissions by 10 billion tons. The proposal exceeds the administration's own 50% electrification target, Bozzella wrote, noting that his industry is fully committed to an electric and low-carbon transportation future. Less than 2 weeks ago, the IRS and Treasury Department issued complex guidance on EV tax credits that could make it harder for consumers to benefit from those financial incentives. Imagine that. Bozella, who began his career working for the New York Mayor David Dinkins, a Democrat, said the guidance would reduce the number of vehicles qualifying for tax credits. That would seem to disincentivize EV adoption, even as the administration steps up other measures intended to facilitate more EV purchases. Bozella also said that 100,000 public, non-proprietary EV chargers in the United States are not enough. An April 6 memo from the Automotive Alliance stated that electrification would take a massive 100-year change to the U.S. industrial base and the way Americans drive. What this article doesn't talk about is the nation's electric grid and if it's even capable of charging all these electric cars, which we can safely assume it's not, because you've already got rolling blackouts and brownouts in states like California, East Coast states, Texas, other places where on a hot day they're telling you to shut off your air conditioners, don't run your washer and dryer, keep your lights off to conserve electricity. All the while, these same states are cutting back on producing power. They've shut down all their coal plants. They want to tear down the dams that create the hydropower. So where is this electricity going to come from? They've shut down nuclear plants as well. How are we supposed to charge all these cars? Where are you going to put all these charging stations? In most populated areas, the space along the freeways is already taken. Are you going to eliminate gas stations altogether and force people who don't have an electric car to not be able to fuel their vehicle? How much money is it going to cost to convert gas stations into electric vehicle charging stations, and who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for the electric vehicle charging stations, the new ones that are built? The government. They've backed us into a corner with electricity because they don't want us using natural gas or coal or oil or nuclear. And so now what? Are we going back to the 1800s? Because you're going to have a lot more electricity to charge these cars and continue to allow people to have the electricity they're accustomed to in their homes. I've said it 100,000 times. These liberal loons, environmental goons, love to come up with all these plans, all these ideas, but they have no plan to implement said ideas. They have no way to make it happen. Somehow it's just going to happen. Unicorns and rainbows, I guess. Hopes and prayers. These true believers of this garbage don't live in reality. And the ones that are going along with it are doing it solely for the purpose of controlling you and everything you have in your life. Here's a really disturbing story. Kansas of all places, House Republicans on Friday promised to override Governor Laura Kelly's veto of a bill that would have required doctors to provide care for babies born alive after a failed abortion or face criminal prosecution. House Speaker Dan Hawkins, a Wichita Republican, said in a statement that he was saddened by the governor's decision to veto the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. The governor has chosen to abandon the dignity of life by allowing for the ending of an infant's life even once it's outside the womb. This veto gives abortionists free rein to walk away as living, breathing baby dies, Hawkins said in a statement. This is not only radical, but also inhumane, and I am confident House Republicans will make every effort during veto session to protect all living, breathing infants in our state, regardless of the conditions surrounding their birth. Kelly, a Democrat, vetoed the first pro-life bill to come to her desk, calling it misleading and unnecessary. The intent of this bill is to interfere in medical decisions that should remain between doctors and their patients. The bill would have required healthcare providers to take the same measures to save the life of a newborn as any reasonably diligent and conscientious provider would with any other live birth. The law would have applied to all instances where a fetus is completely expelled or extracted from the mother, which includes induced labor abortions. The GOP has majority in both the House and the Senate of the state legislature. This means that if the support for the bill remains strong, Kelly's veto could be overturned. The House voted 86-36 in favor of the bill. The Senate voted 31-9 in favor of the bill. Similar laws have been enacted in 18 other states, such as Arizona, Florida, Ohio, and Texas, while one was rejected by voters in Montana in November last year. What kind of sick bitch doesn't want a law or is okay with a baby being born under whatever circumstances alive and then left to die on the operating table? That is murder. That is sick and disgusting that we as a quote-unquote civilized society would allow this to happen. There is a special place in hell for people that think this is okay. It's sick. The Department of Energy on April 13th affirmed a Trump-era decision to export liquefied natural gas from a facility in Alaska. Under the Trump administration in 2020, a company called Alaska LNG was authorized to export LNG to any country with which the United States hasn't entered into a free trade agreement. In a supplemental record of the decision issued by the DOE on April 13th, Biden administration officials reaffirmed the original authorization in 2020. However, they also amended the project to include more restrictions intended to protect the environment. The decision on April 13th comes after the Sierra Club, an organization that seeks to fight for environmental and social justice, in September 2020 filed a request for rehearing over the matter. The department had agreed to the request to look further into the project's environmental impacts, after which it would either reaffirm, modify, or set aside the Trump-era authorization. Upon review, DOE finds that the environmental impacts presented are not sufficient to alter DOE's determination that exports of LNG from the proposed Alaska LNG project to non-profit FTA countries are not inconsistent with public interest. One modification that was made was requiring the company to certify each month that the natural gas produced for export in LNG form did not result in the venting of byproduct carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, unless required for emergency maintenance or operational exigencies, in compliance with the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, order for the Alaska LNG project. The latest move comes a month after the Biden administration approved the $8 billion Willow oil field development project to allow the company ConocoPhillips to drill for oil over 3 decades. It also comes a year after the Biden administration expanded exports of LNG to Europe. President Joe Biden announced an agreement in March 2022 that committed the U.S. industry to supply 15 billion cubic meters more of LNG to Europe for the remainder of the year. I'm sorry, but we need to keep these resources here because they're needed here. America first. The U.S. Space Development Agency, SDA, successfully launched the first of what's planned to become a planetary constellation made up of hundreds of satellites as America's first line of defense against enemy missiles. Isn't that great? Someday you're going to look up at the sky at night and not even be able to see stars because the whole sky is going to be full of satellites. The launch came as the United States steps up its actions to counter threats posed by China and Russia. A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket took off from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California on April 2nd and deployed the first 10 satellites in low Earth orbit. SDA is the agency within the Space Force that procures and deploys space defense technology in partnership with private industry. Proliferation is the key to making the system immediately useful in tracking missiles anywhere in the world and to making it invulnerable to attack. By deploying hundreds of small, relatively expensive devices rather than a few large satellites costing billions of dollars each, the network will be more versatile and easier to keep current. The satellites will be launched in 3 groups and will be initially operational within 2 years. The 10 initial satellites were part of Tranche 0, which will demonstrate the military's ability to tie missile tracking satellites together through intermediary satellites, which are called transport satellites. A second group, Tranche 0 launch, will deliver the remaining 18 satellites in that group. Once linked, the network will allow the SDA to communicate information on incoming missiles to the Space Force units responsible for eliminating them. Tranche 1, made up of about 150 satellites, will begin lifting off in September and continue at the pace of about 1 launch each month. These satellites will build out the network of warning, tracking, and transport satellites. When fully deployed, Tranche 1 will allow us to be able to bring the capability directly to the warfighter to support a fight in 2025. Tranche 2 will include more than 200 satellites. It will improve the PWSA's ability to provide persistent global coverage. 350 satellites for this particular program alone. It's insane, the amount of stuff that they're putting up there. What kind of other surveillance do you suppose those satellites will be capable of? Because it's not just going to be for tracking missiles. I guarantee you that. It'll be used for tracking all kinds of other things. There are currently 48,000 objects in low Earth orbit. 48,000. Despite the potential of an anti-satellite attack and the possibility of collision of one of these 48,000 objects, PWSA should be relatively safe, according to the program manager. I'm not worried about physical threats to the satellites themselves. The way we get around that is by proliferation. We'll have hundreds and hundreds of these satellites up there. It will cost more to shoot down a single satellite than it costs to build and launch the satellite. We just completely changed the equation. The next launch of PWSA satellites is slated for June. Well, if you're wondering why we need hundreds of satellites in the air, this could be a big reason why. Those leaked documents recently from the Pentagon, some of those documents indicated that China had carried out a successful test of a new missile called a DF-27, which belongs to the Dongfang series of hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missiles. All missiles in the Dongfang family have the potential to deploy nuclear warheads. The DF-27 missile in particular possesses a high probability of penetrating U.S. ballistic missile defenses, according to the report. In addition, the memo dated February 28th disclosed that the People's Liberation Army, China's military, had developed variants of the new missile capable of assaulting both land and sea-based targets in the previous year. The recently developed missile poses a hypersonic glide vehicle that can travel at a speed of more than 5 times the speed of sound. Its in-flight maneuvering capability makes it highly resistant to interception, according to the leaked document. During the test, the DF-27 missile flew for 12 minutes and covered a distance of 2,100 kilometers or 1,300 miles, the report said. Its range is significantly more than that. A 2021 Defense Department report cited by the Washington Post said the DF-27 has a range of 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers, meaning that it can strike any target in East or Southeast Asia and large parts of the Pacific, including Guam. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're more concerned about trans kids being taken from parents and reducing the number of gas-driven cars on the road and making you pay more for electricity that we don't have enough of, and raising your taxes. Be sure to buy your potassium iodide tablets, folks. Well, if the UN is that creepy uncle, then North Korea must be that tweaker cousin that nobody wants to talk about. North Korea's 40-minute test launch of a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile on April 13th caused evacuations on Japan's Hokkaido Island, and analysts to sound the alarm that the new missile would make it easier for the regime to launch a nuclear attack. The launch off North Korea's east coast into the Sea of Japan was documented in real time by South Korea's military, which classified it as an intermediate or long-range missile. On April 14th, in a statement issued to state-run Korean Central News Agency, North Korea announced it had successfully launched a three-stage Hwasong-18 ICBM. A new type of intercontinental ballistic missile was test-fired on Thursday as the key means of strategic military force, KCNA said, describing the test as a miraculous success. Often referred to as a firecracker rocket, the Hwasong-18 uses a solid chemical mixture propellant cast into the missile's airframe at 5,000 degrees to generate enough thrust to launch multi-stage missiles and warheads. Solid fuel launch capability gives the Hwasong-18 its primary advantage, according to military analysts and North Korea watchers such as those as 38north.com. Liquid-fueled missiles require fuel and oxidizers be inserted before they can be launched, which require numerous time-consuming, cumbersome steps. Once hours-long fueling has begun, the missiles must be launched. In addition, each liquid-fueled missile must be escorted by fuel trucks, which makes tracking their movements and targeting them easier. This guy is such a goon in North Korea. How long before they just blow themselves up by accident messing around with these missiles? Not soon enough.
Thank you for listening to the Behind the Line podcast. If you like this broadcast, please like and share it. Please follow us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, Twitter, Truth Social, Telegram, Gab, Parler, and LinkedIn. You can find our podcast at BehindTheLinePodcast.com, NetNewsNetwork.net, and on Anchor, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and anywhere podcasts can be found. Thank you for your support.